Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another fantastic episode of Remake or Rebreak. Last time we discussed Spyro the Dragon for the PS1, as well as its remake in the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. Overall, I thought Spyro 1 was a pretty solid collectathon, but I couldn't help but find myself fatigued with the lack of variety by the back half of the game. At the end of the day, Spyro 1 was still a great game, ripe for expansion and a sequel. On that note, today we're looking at Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage for the PlayStation, as well as its remake of the Spyro Reignited Trilogy. I'd call the game Gateway to Glimmer or Ton Demo Tours, but I'm US American. For one reason or another, Spyro 2 is generally considered the best game in the trilogy, but do I agree? As always, Remake or Rebreak is a review segment where I look at the classics of the past to see how well they hold up today, with a special emphasis on how well subsequent significant re-releases, which include remakes, later gen ports, remasters, reimaginings, etc., recreate and improve upon the original experience. Today, I want to discuss three questions. First, how will the Spyro 2 hold up in 2020 as a game on its own? Second, how will the Spyro 2 Reignited live up to the high standards of Toys for Bob's excellent work with Spyro 1? Finally, do I think Spyro 2 deserves its reputation as the best game in the series? Without further ado, this is Spyro 2 Remake or Rebreak. Now, normally I start these reviews by looking at the story. Essentially, Spyro is transported to the kooky world of Avalar and must help its denizens defeat the evil Ripto by exploring levels to collect talismans and orbs. For various reasons, I've decided to save the plot discussion for the end, so for now, let's move on to the visuals. As always, I'm running the original Spyro 2 on authentic hardware over RGB SCART, playing on a PVM monitor, and digitizing with the open source scan converter. Like the previous game, Spyro 2 outputs a 512 by 240 image. However, unlike the previous game, the internal resolution has been reduced to 512 by 216, matching Naughty Dog's Crash games. You'll recall that Spyro 1 struggled with occasional screen tearing throughout the game, so I imagine they sacrificed the 8 extra lines to improve performance. Personally, I barely noticed the missing pixels on my PVM, and 216p also upscales cleanly to 4K, so no harm, no foul as far as I'm concerned. While Spyro 2 maintains a consistent 30 FPS for the most part, screen tearing is still a problem here despite the lower resolution. It's not common enough to ruin the game or hamper playability, but it happens just frequently enough to be distracting. Anyways, part of the reason why the first Spyro aged so well was its unique visual style. Both characters and environments had a distinct Spyro flavor that, along with the higher than average resolution, helped the game stand out among other 1998 releases. When it comes to visuals, Spyro 2 takes the next logical steps in fidelity and variety and feels like a natural evolution for the series. Spyro 1 was set in the Dragon Kingdom and featured mostly reskinned dragon elders and an assortment of Nork baddies. In terms of environments, I appreciated Spyro 1's strong visual theming for each tier, but found it made stages blend together after a while. Spyro 2, meanwhile, takes place in Avalar and features an assortment of outlandish NPCs to interact with, each stranger than the last. While the models are still low poly and low res, the creative character designs and artistic flair make up for this tenfold, with characters like Moneybags, Hunter, and Ripto becoming instantly iconic. We also have Electrolls, meditating turtle gurus, satyrs, mini hippos with wings and a fez, aka Phil Fish, robot business persons, whatever the hell these are, and Kevin Bacon. That's not to mention the enemy designs, which include rock monsters, snail fints, wicked warlocks, space cows, kangaroos with flying squirrel wings, and even a man in a turban named Bamo. Not surprisingly, this character is renamed to Bob in the remake. On the environment side, no two stages look remotely the same and tend to combine level archetypes rather than playing them straight like the first game. Colossus, for example, combines the temple and snow archetypes, while Robotica Farms combines the farm and factory archetypes. Others like Mystic Marsh, Hurricos, and Breeze Harbor defy archetypes altogether and stand out in a sea of homogeneous-looking platformers. Even more traditional stages like Crystal Glacier and Skelos Badlands are still oozing with that Spyro flair. In terms of the art itself, the characters and environments are better modeled, the use of color is stronger and more coherent, and the textures are simply better drawn. Taken together, Spyro 2 was simply more creative and better on the eyes compared to Spyro 1. In the case of the Reignited Trilogy version, we're playing on the PC to maximize graphical fidelity with native 4K 60 frames per second. Last time, I sang the praises for the overhauled visuals in the Reignited Reignited Trilogy. As great as Spyro 1 Reignited looked, I'd say Spyro 2 Reignited actually looks considerably better. In many respects, it's a continuation of the same production value. The overall art style is consistent with the remake of the first game, striking a perfect balance between a cartoony aesthetic and the higher fidelity. And the quality of the models and environments is certainly on par with Spyro 1 Reignited as well. Ultimately, I think the difference comes down to the more creative environments and settings. Spyro 2 on PlayStation was already more visually varied and creative than the first game, so when Toys for Bob et al. Set out to remake the visuals, the graphics naturally ended up more varied and creative than their work for Spyro 1. Once again, the environments are stunning and use a state-of-the-art lighting engine, high-resolution materials, beautiful particle effects, and the list just goes on. Levels like Glimmer, Winter Tundra, Hurricos, and Cloud Temples have simply never looked better, and it really breathes new life into a game I've replayed countless times. Unlike Spyro 1 Reignited, which completely redesigned the NPCs to make them more unique, Spyro 2 Reignited is surprisingly loyal to the original character designs when it comes to rando NPCs. Sure, there's a few minor differences, but nothing too radical. Hunter and the Professor look pretty much like you'd expect them to, Crush and Gulp look far more imposing, and Moneybags has an elegant sophistication to his gesture and movements that sell the character as a money-grubbing asshole. The only redesign that gives me pause is Alora. There's something about her face that makes me uncomfortable in a way I can't really describe. But come to think of it, I could say the same thing about her original model. My vote for the best redesign, however, is Ripto. He was supposed to be a short dinosaur sorcerer, but in the original game, he just looks like a Muppet. And the less said about his prehensile dick horn and Enter the Dragonfly, the better. His Reignited redesign, however, is simply badass. His outfit and gesture are elegant and sinister, with the sharp teeth and beady eyes really selling him as some kind of dinosaur. This is simply the best the character has ever looked. Full stop. As promised, I also did a second playthrough of Spyro 2 Reignited on the Xbox One X. As you recall, the Reignited Trilogy ran at 1080p 30fps on PS4 and 1440p 30fps on PS4 Pro, which is consistent with the Crash Insane Trilogy on PS4 as well. However, despite the Crash Trilogy running at native 4K 30fps on Xbox One X, the Spyro Trilogy shows no noticeable performance improvements over its Sony equivalent. Now, remember, the Xbox One X is considerably more powerful than the PS4 Pro and the most powerful game console currently on the market. Granted, the Reignited Trilogy does run in the cross-platform Unreal Engine 4 rather than an Xbox-optimized engine, but so did the Insane Trilogy. If Crash could handle native 4K on Xbox One X, then I don't see why Spyro can't. Now, 1440p is still a nice-looking resolution at least, and unlike the PS4 Pro, the Xbox can output in 1440p standard so you can play the game in perfect pixels on a 2K monitor or something. What actually does bother me is that, much like the PS4 version, the frame rate and frame pacing is noticeably stuttery and uneven on Xbox. A lot of people interpreted my criticisms of the frame pacing in the last review as a form of PC elitism, and I can certainly understand that, so let me clarify. I own tons of game consoles, and I've played plenty of games that look smooth at 30fps on console. And certainly I understand that not everybody has the time, money, or interest to get into PC gaming, and that consoles provide an affordable, accessible alternative. That being said, even by console standards, I don't find the 30fps in the console versions of the Reignited Trilogy to be as smooth as other games, and I think that's a worthwhile criticism to make, especially in a comparison piece like this. Like in the last episode, I went back through my footage frame by frame in post and found that, for the most part, the Reignited Trilogy outputs a consistent 30fps. So why doesn't it look like it when I'm actually playing the game? Since publishing my Spyro 1 review, I've learned from commenters and watching Digital Foundry that it all has to do with small inconsistencies in the video timings. If you divide 1 second into 30 even chunks, you get 33.33 milliseconds. So, for 30fps to look smooth, the game needs to deliver a frame every 33.33 milliseconds on the dot. However, like many other Unreal Engine 4 games on console, the Reignited Trilogy will deliver a new frame anywhere from 16.66 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds, which averages out to roughly 30 FPS overall. While these differences don't sound like much in the grand scheme of things, it disrupts the illusion of movement because your brain is expecting to receive visual feedback in a certain rhythm. While I expected these inconsistent video timings to appear as dropped frames in my footage, it seems that my LiveGamer 4K capture card has just been rounding out the frame rate during the encoding process. In other words, you'll just have to trust me, and Digital Foundry, that this game looks smoother in footage than it does in real time. Now, like with the PS4 version, my eyes did eventually adjust to it, and the game is certainly very playable. And from what I've read, the frame pacing seems marginally better on Xbox One X than it was on PS4 Pro. I also understand that the frame pacing issue is going to be more noticeable for some gamers than others, and that's okay. So, if you're not a big frame rate gamer and just want a convenient way to play Spyro in 2020, you'll certainly get what you're looking for on PS4 and Xbox One. However, for my money, I still think the PC version is the way to go. Even if you have to turn down the resolution to 720p, the consistently paced 60 FPS makes the game feel loads better to play in my opinion. However, like Spyro 1 Reignited, the game does occasionally drop to the high 50s, with the underwater sections being the most consistent culprits in that regard. Then again, I'm running the game at 4K with maxed out settings, so I'm sure that plays into it, but even on Xbox One X, the underwater areas seem to have trouble keeping pace with the frame rate. Which brings us to the soundtrack. Stuart Copeland scored the first game, which had a unique fantasy style and atmosphere, but only a few true bangers in the 40-piece track list. Copeland returns for Ripto's Rage, and this soundtrack is a considerable improvement. From frame 1, the title screen gives you a face full of the Glimmer theme, which perfectly captures the emotion of embarking on a new adventure in a strange new world. The usual bells, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, pipe organ, and drum kit return from the first game, accompanied by the atmospheric flourishes Spyro is known for. Copeland expands the soundscape further by bringing in rough, esoteric samples that jive with Avalar's fundamentally kooky atmosphere, along with contextually appropriate samples like bamboo flute, Arabic drums, chorus, whistling, etc. The boss themes, particularly Gulp, employ a more orchestral sound, bringing in violin chords and piano riffs. The compositions in Ripto's Rage are much catchier and more varied, making for a soundtrack that's easy to hum and whistle as you play the game. It's really good stuff, with my favorites being Glimmer, Colossus, Crush's Dungeon, Scorch, Aquaria Towers, Metropolis, and the final boss theme. As great as the soundtrack is, the hub world themes are kind of mediocre. Now, unlike Spyro 1, where each of the hub themes were unique and reflected the dragons that lived there, the hub themes in Spyro 2 are bland, interchangeable, ambient textures. One might argue that it's meant to make you feel safe between stages, and sure, but I thought the hub themes in Spyro 1, Spyro 3, Enter the Dragonfly, and the GBA games all did that perfectly well while having actual melodies. But if that's the worst I can say about this soundtrack, then I think we're in good hands. As far as the Reignited soundtrack goes, the soundtrack was once again reversioned by Steven Vankov. Like I said last time, the problem with trying to remix Spyro was that the audio fidelity of the originals was about as good as it realistically could be. For Spyro 1 Reignited, I wanted something unique to stand apart from the original, and what I got was so loyal to the original that it couldn't stand out as its own thing. That said, I'd say Vankov's showing is stronger for Spyro 2 Reignited, because there are actually some tracks I prefer to the originals. These include Hurricane, Scorch, and maybe Robotica Farms. The rest fall into the same category as the last game. I can tell they sound different, and they don't sound bad per se, but they don't do much to positively stand apart from the original tracks. Like Spyro 1 Reignited, Spyro 2 Reignited carries over the dynamic music option, which makes the track softer while standing still and adds a percussion line when charging. One detail I do appreciate is that while the original reused the Idle Springs theme and Fractured Hills, Steven Vankov created a unique mix for each of these stages. For the most part, tracks aren't actively worse to listen to, but once again, I must ask, if they weren't going to do anything different with the music in the remake, why even remake the soundtrack at all? Now, of course, if you prefer the PlayStation soundtrack, you can choose to play the game with the original Copeland score if you want, which I did in my Xbox run just for the hell of it. Last time, I noted the Reignited soundtrack was rewritten slightly so it would loop cleanly, as opposed to the original PlayStation games where the music would fade out completely, followed by 5 seconds of silence. What I neglected to mention is that if you choose to play the Reignited Trilogy with the original music, the original tracks have been edited to loop as well. While I haven't dabbled in the Unreal Engine Sound Manager, I imagine these edits were made for smoother transitions between the original and Reignited soundtracks in the pause menu. Otherwise, the tracks would have had to start over whenever you switched. While the loop edits sound fine on 98% of tracks and usually just cut out a repeated loop of the song rather than anything meaningfully different or new, the loop edits are cleaner on some tracks than others. For example, with Sunny Via in the third game, it's pretty obvious and kind of distracting. Otherwise, I have to be actively listening for it to notice the edit. I can understand if some longtime fans find that distracting, but personally, I'd argue that trailing out into 5 seconds of silence is distracting in its own right. Personally, I didn't mind it that much, but that's just me. In any event, that brings us to the gameplay. Spyro 2, like most sequels, offers fundamentally the same gameplay. You walk, charge, jump, glide, and flame your way through stages while defeating enemies and collecting gems. Right off the bat, the controls are noticeably better compared to Spyro 1. In Spyro 1, the controls were good enough, but the center of gravity on the charge animation was skewed towards the front, meaning your back end would slide all over the place. In Spyro 2, the analog movement from the DualShock feels smoother and the charging feels slightly slower but more responsive, with charge jumps having a higher reach. The sound design has also been updated with the classic Spyro Soundtrack, and fans of the series will know exactly what clips I'm talking about. Again, there was nothing wrong with the sound design in Spyro 1 per se, but these new clips are punchier and add viscera to the movement. It's exactly the kind of polish you'd hope for in a sequel. Other than that, the core gameplay of platforming, combat, and exploration carries over verbatim to the second game. Jumping and gliding across pits, flaming and charging enemies, and collecting gems were all fun in the last game, and they're just as intrinsically satisfying here. The only real difference is that gems now have unique shapes, and the fan and hopping chests have been removed in favor of just baskets, faces, and fireworks jars. Personally, I'm not sure why, but whatever. In my last review, I discussed elegance in game design, defining it as a ratio of affordances to system's complexity. As a wise man once said, fun exists somewhere between boredom and confusion. To keep that ratio closer to 1-to-1, the system's designers need to increase the number of affordances along with the complexity of the systems to keep players engaged. Otherwise, they'll eventually get the game's number and become bored. My biggest problem with Spyro 1 is that beyond the supercharge and super flame, the mechanics didn't really evolve as the game progressed, meaning that eventually the game starts to get boring because you're doing fundamentally the same thing for 4 hours straight. Evidently, the Spyro 2 team agreed with me and attempted to address this with a host of unlockable moves you acquire as the game progresses. On paper, these new moves should help address the elegance issue, but how do they fare in practice? From the start, Spyro can now hover by pressing triangle at the end of a glide, which would previously make you drop like a rock in Spyro 1. Personally, I'm not sure why they chose to put the hover on triangle instead of cross, but it works. You also have the ability to lick up projectiles and then spit them out in first-person mode. Again, it's simple but fun for what it is. Now, the rest of the new mechanics must be unlocked, starting with swimming. This is easily my favorite addition to Spyro 2. Essentially, you paddle with cross or charge with square, and it just feels satisfying and controls well with both the analog stick or the D-pad. Because you unlock swimming at the beginning, swimming sections actually appear throughout the whole game, though maybe only a third of stages actually include them. My only criticism with these sections is that the camera isn't as responsive as I'd like, and in that regard, the camera has not improved whatsoever from Spyro 1. The stupid strafe move is gone at least, so now both sets of bumpers just do the same thing, only now you can tap L and R together to center the camera. This is a helpful new feature that makes certain sections easier, but since I have to press 2 buttons this time, I tend to forget it's in this game. We still have the active camera system to pick up some of the slack, but the shoulder rotation is still way too slow, unfortunately. The game once again supports DualShock controllers, but again leaves the right stick completely unused. I'll remind you that Glimmer on PS1 came out the same year and had analog camera control, so why couldn't this? The next move you unlock is the ability to climb ladders, but in practice this doesn't add much at all and only serves to arbitrarily gate progression. The only clever use of this mechanic is in Magma Cone, where you climb around this volcano while dodging obstacles. Now, to be fair, climbing doesn't feel that smooth to play, which is probably why they never did much with it. Finally, Spyro can unlock a head bash, which you trigger by jumping and tapping triangle. It's satisfying to use, but you unlock it so far into the game that the use case is extremely limited. You kill some robot bugs, open a few chests, and make a couple elevators move, and that's it. So while I don't hate any of the new moves and rather enjoy swimming and hovering, ultimately this doesn't make a dent on the elegance issue from the last game, nor are the mechanics complicated enough to justify being unlockable. Again, I tolerated unlocking moves in Banjo-Kazooie because many of them relied on button combinations that weren't very intuitive or were complicated or varied enough to justify pacing them out over the entire game. Spyro 2 has no such excuse. I mean, is it really that difficult to figure out how to jump against a wall? Seems like something I should just have at the start. The hover is actually more complicated than the head bash and uses similar button inputs, so making it unlockable doesn't make sense either. Swimming is actually the most complicated new mechanic, but is the first thing you unlock, so the mechanical pacing excuse just doesn't fly here. Overall, climbing and the head bash are overly simple mechanics that don't add meaningful new options for combat or progression, meaning they don't affect either side of the elegance ratio. Both of them amount to a glorified press button to continue moment and add little else to the core gameplay. Spyro 2 Reignited brings back the same control scheme as Spyro 1 Reignited. The right stick offers full camera control and inversion options, but the sensitivity is still too low. Thankfully, I did learn between reviews that you can increase the sensitivity of the right stick on PC by taking advantage of the Unreal Engine serialization of config data. Simply navigate to the address here, substituting my name with your username, and locate input.ini. Open it up in Notepad and reference the input settings class in the brackets here. Then enter the following code on the lines below for the engine to read on startup. Then simply change the sensitivity values to your liking. While there is a bool on the end to control inversion, I found that it doesn't actually do anything, so I suggest simply making the sensitivity values negative if you want inversion. Enter it all correctly and voila! Actually good camera sensitivity. Just another reason to avoid this game on console and play it on PC. Now, of course, if you don't want to bother with any of that, you can always just use the camera centering feature on the left trigger, which was good enough for me. Either way, the new camera makes the swimming sections much easier to navigate. The Reignited Trilogy in general just feels better to control for the same reasons I stated in my Spyro 1 review. The analog movement is more robust and the sound design is expertly crafted to maximize the feedback of every movement. The only new thing to add is that the head bash animation is simply amazing. I'm not really sure what compelled Toys for Bob to bring back the strafe feature from Spyro 1, but it's certainly not hurting anything either. Before getting into the stages, let's talk about the bosses. The bosses in Spyro 1 were pretty lame, all things considered, but thankfully each one had a full-size level to make up for it. Spyro 2 decreases the number of bosses, but greatly improves with the three we do get: Crush, Gulp, and Ripto. Each boss gets a full 3D arena to run around in, and each involves some kind of unique conceit that makes them interesting to fight. With Gulp, for example, you need to find ammunition to damage the boss, with each weapon operating under different rules. Crush, meanwhile, moves between these pads and attacks you with fire or electricity. Both bosses evolve their strategy as you progress, meaning you're tested on the same skills without the fight becoming too repetitive or boring. Despite all of Ripto's faults, I can definitely give the designers credit for absolutely nailing the final boss. A multi-stage fight that revolves around grabbing orbs to unlock power-ups, ending with a dogfight to the death over a pit of molten lava. It's easily the best final boss fight in the series. Needless to say, these bosses are way better than the ones from the first game, and possibly the best of any collectathon I've ever played. It certainly stands head and shoulders above Super Mario 64 or Banjo-Tooie's bosses. If I had to nitpick, I do find that Gulp's life bar is too beefy, especially since you have to do the whole thing with no checkpoints. Oh, and there's technically a fourth boss battle against an ox in a skating rink. Yeah, that's something I should probably mention. There are ice physics in this game, and I'm really not a fan. While it's fine for basic platforming and collecting, trying to fight a boss with them is just annoying, especially when you need to to be lined up perfectly to bat these bombs back at the Aux. Even at its best, this boss is just kind of okay. But like I said, the other three are pretty good. Moving on, it's time to talk about the level design in Spyro 2. Stages in Spyro 1 were expertly designed and properly rewarded explorative players with cleverly hidden gems. Every stage could be 100%ed on a first visit, while allowing repeat players to clean up their route in subsequent playthroughs. The result is a game that's fun to 100% and replayable as all hell. So, how well does Spyro 2 follow up on the excellent design of its predecessor? Well, there's probably no better place to start than by analyzing the first stage, Glimmer. This stage is structured similarly to Dark Hollow from the first game. It's a mostly linear romp with some open areas and a handful of low-tension enemies. It's an overall solid stage that tutorializes mechanics well and introduces Moneybags paywall so any percenters remember to pick up gems when they can, and caps it off with some fantastic music. Speaking of which, all the major progression gates are based around talismans, which you receive at the end of the first 14 stages, and orbs, which you mostly receive for completing minigames. Thus, Moneybags serves as a paywall in levels and hubs, but as long as you're collecting treasure consistently, you should always have enough. In general, stages follow up on the Glimmer formula while adding some kind of unique progression gimmick. For example, in Hurricos, you need to collect these diodes to repair the local machinery and progress. Aquaria Towers was drained of all its water, so you need to press these switches to refill the towers and continue. You get the idea. While these sound like they would open up new gameplay in every stage, in practice, all they really amount to is killing some enemies on the beaten path or maybe pushing some switches. The stages themselves are mostly linear romps, and while some of them have a point of no return loop back to the start of the stage, many of them don't even have that. There are also optional areas you can visit to play minigames or collect some gems, but yeah. Overall, the level design is good, but I still prefer Spyro 1's level design for several reasons. For a start, Spyro 1 stages had more intricate layouts and were more challenging overall. By contrast, I kind of felt like I was on autopilot for most of the stages in Spyro 2. In my last review, I praised Spyro 1 for rewarding explorative players with secret areas that emphasize clever glides and thinking outside the box. With the exception of this one glide in Autumn Plains, Spyro 2 is seriously lacking in these aha moments. There are optional areas, yeah, but they don't match the excitement of discovering the hidden gems in Clifftown, uncovering the secret back area of Wizard Peak, or figuring out how to nail these pesky thieves in treetops. Similarly, I credited Spyro 1 for its simple but effective enemy design compared to other collectathons. Unlike those games, enemies like the attack frogs, armored turtles, and shepherd's dogs actually put you through your paces. Meanwhile, in Spyro 2, you can easily dispatch almost every enemy without thought or consequence. The only meaningful exceptions I can think of are these tree guys that throw bees at you, the earth shapers you need to push into lava, and the metal sharks, which are essentially instant kill versions of the metalback spiders from high caves. As a result, Spyro 2 stages are generally a linear romp where you kill some enemies, push a few switches, and call it a day. Like I said, Spyro himself controls better than the first game, and the core gameplay is still intrinsically satisfying, which counts for a lot. This game has solid overall systems design, but the level design, where those systems are put into practice, doesn't really do anything substantially new or clever with it. When you dig deeper, the stages only get worse from here. In Spyro 1, each defeated enemy dropped a gem, with each gem being a one-time collectible. Unlike, say, Banjo-Tooie, where in practice enemies only served to annoy and weren't fun to fight at all, Spyro 1 not only had challenging enemies, but rewarded you with gems for taking time to kill them all. While that did mean you had to kill all the enemies to 100% the stage, that was never really a problem in my opinion. If there was ever a tricky gem I was missing, it was almost never an enemy drop. Every classic Spyro game, including the GBA games, employs the Spyro 1 system of defeated enemies dropping gems. except for Spyro 2. For whatever reason, enemies now drop spirit particles instead, which then activate the power-up gates once you defeat enough enemies. For most levels, the spirit particle system doesn't really change that much, seeing as I'm used to killing all the enemies and never had a problem finding enough to get the gates up and running. Regardless, spirit particles are just a less satisfying reward than gems were, and unlike gems, you don't keep them if you have to come back to a stage later. On that note, Spyro 2's biggest level design problem is backtracking within stages themselves. Spyro 1 had a little of this in stages like Dark Hollow, Haunted Towers, or Ice Cavern, where you might have had to collect a key farther in the stage and then backtrack to a locked chest. I didn't really like it there either, but that was the worst it ever got. Spyro 1 was also good about offering shortcuts so you weren't wasting your time replaying platforming sections you already finished. In Spyro 2, you'll find yourself wandering back and forth across the same patches of level design over and over again. While there are some shortcuts like the Spring Gates in Colossus or Mystic Marsh, many stages are severely lacking in this regard. Now, to be fair, there are stages like Crystal Glacier, Breeze Harbor, Cloud Temples, and Magma Cone that keep these elements to a minimum, but most stages have quite a bit of back and forth in them. Let's look at Fracture Hills as an example. This stage is structured like a giant donut with an upper level, a lower level, and a bunch of cliff tops. It's actually one of the few stages where the end of the stage loops into the start with no strings attached. However, the multi-tier structure of this stage makes it so that there's not really an optimal path to route it, especially with the cliff tops. On top of that, there's also a supercharged track that you have to lap 3 times for a skill point and a 4th time for an orb. Skelos Badlands, Zephyr, Shady Oasis, and Robotica Farms also include these mystery jars you have to destroy to 100% the stage, which essentially amounts to playing the stage backwards and repeatedly smashing this jar until it feels like giving you the gems. Does anybody enjoy these? Metropolis is a relatively straightforward stage, but even this level makes you go through a power-up gate so you can go backwards and destroy a chest. Speaking of which, to fully complete Aquaria Towers, you'll have to backtrack through the entire stage with Super Flame killing sharks and breaking chests for gems, as well as destroying all the seaweed for a skill point. The fact that the power-up has a time limit means you have to keep backtracking to the very beginning of the stage over and over and over, and it just sucks. By the time you open this gate, you've already killed all of the enemies anyway, so why can't it just last for the rest of the stage? Even in stages without mystery jars, there's usually a minigame that will force you to retread old ground. In Glimmer, for example, you'll meet an NPC who will ask you to slowly follow him backwards through the stage while occasionally stopping to kill lizards. On top of the seaweed and chests, Aquaria Towers also has an annoying minigame where you basically replay the entire stage again while stopping to swim up these towers and save baby seahorses. There's no tension, there's no challenge, it's just swimming through a level you've already played again. In Shady Oasis and Mystic Marsh, you need to chase down 3 thieves to collect some MacGuffins for an NPC. Now on paper, this is just like red coins, Jinjos, or scout flies, minor collectibles that unlock a major collectible. However, unlike those games or even the egg thieves in Spyro 1, these thieves won't appear until you've already talked to an NPC at the very end of the stage. Why? If the lamp thieves and spark plug thieves were just in the stage from the beginning, like the destructible objects in the GBA games, I wouldn't mind them at all. But the designers added an unnecessary level of backtracking for no real reason. And then we have Bommo the Flag Keeper. Oh joy. Easily the most boring, frustrating, pointless minigame in Spyro 2. For some reason, Hando really needs these flags from this level, so you have to shoot down the flag keeper and chase him to the end of the stage, where he will suddenly drop the flag for no reason. This minigame follows the Conker's Bad Fur Day school of difficulty design, where the designer's idea of increasing tension is just making you repeat the same boring task except with extra steps. This minigame just amounts to running through a stage you've already played over and over and over again, and it's just not fun. To make matters worse, Bob here throws much bigger projectiles in the remake than on PlayStation, with some truly bullshit collision detection, so I found myself needing to walk to properly avoid these fireballs. Thus, a repetitive, boring minigame just became all the slower. All of this comes to a head in possibly the worst stage in the original trilogy, Zephyr. I'd replay Treetops or Lost Fleet over this borefest in a heartbeat. Not only is this the only stage in Spyro 2 to feature 4 orbs, but it takes the within-level backtracking to even lower heights with the goddamn cowlick minigame. Yeah, how would you like to slowly herd 7 cowlicks back to a pen in the middle of the stage one by one? Sounds like fun, right? Well, guess what? It isn't. Rather than keeping the cowlicks to one confined part of the stage, they chose to spread these fuckers out as far as humanly possible. On top of that, there's an entire second chunk of the stage where you have to run around collecting seeds and planting them to create platforms. In the middle of that, you have to waste your time herding cowlicks back to Little Craig Smith.
My name is Little Bo Peep, and I've lost my cowlicks.
Once you're finally done with all of that, you'll realize that you're still not done, because there's a fucking mystery jar that you have to follow back to the very beginning of the stage. It's not the length that's the problem here. It's the fact that most of that length comes from mundane, boring tasks or redoing gameplay I've already finished. While I personally find the within-level backtracking more offensive, Spyro 2 contains its fair share of between-level backtracking as well. Unlike Spyro 1, where every single stage could be completed in one choreographed run, it is impossible to fully complete Spyro 2 under normal circumstances without revisiting at least some earlier stages. While backtracking like this can add to a game when it's done well, in Spyro 2's case it only serves to bog down the pace and waste the player's time. Before I go any further, I need to clarify that yes, I am well aware that there are sequence-breaking glitches in Spyro 2 that allow you to bypass a considerable amount of the between-level backtracking. Well, actually, as it turns out, I'm just a colossal dumbass. Apparently, there's a well-known cheat code you can use to unlock all your abilities anytime you want. Simply pause the game, hit circle 4 times, then press square, and bombos your uncle. While a seemingly small change, this cheat drastically improves the 100% experience of Glimmer, Sunny Beach, Summer Forest, Fracture Hills, and Shady Oasis. I always found those last 2 especially annoying to come back for reasons we'll get to in a minute, and it feels so good to be able to fully complete them right off the bat after playing the game normally for so long. While this cheat code does render my complaints about the backtracking completely moot, if Spyro 2 had simply followed up on the superior design of Spyro 1, where every single stage could be completed in one visit, no exceptions, I wouldn't need to input a cheat code or learn a bunch of speedrunning glitches just to make the progression design more palatable. More importantly, this cheat code was actually removed in the Reignited Trilogy, along with all the previous speedrunning glitches. So as long as the remake is still forcing you to backtrack outside of New Game Plus and learn new speedrunning techniques, I feel like it's worthwhile to critique the backtracking as it was intended to be experienced. Right in the first level, you'll find a ladder leading to a super flight power-up you need to light these gem lamps as well as collect some gems. Only problem is, as I mentioned earlier, you can't climb ladders at the start of the game. Now, let's assume that you're a kid in 1999 and you don't know about the cheat code or the double jump glitch that lets you finagle your way up there. The way the designers intended for you to play this was for the player to leave Glimmer partially completed, defeat Crush, buy the move from Moneybags, and then finally come back and 100% this stage. What, may I ask, is the point of this? Again, unlocking the ladder climb isn't justified from a mechanical pacing perspective because it's as simple as jumping on a wall, and the mechanic itself isn't that interesting to begin with, so why force me to unlock it and then come back to fully complete this stage. Thankfully, in the case of swimming, you can play Colossus first and save Idle Springs for later. You still have to go backwards to get the orb by the Glimmer pond, but I can live with that. Getting around ladder-related backtracking, meanwhile, requires either the cheat code or sequence-breaking glitches. Sunny Beach includes 2 ladders, one that leads to some gems and a much taller one at the very end of the stage that leads to a minigame. In Summer Forest, there's another ladder that leads to some gems and an orb. Finally, of course, we have head bash-related backtracking, and the only way around these is to either input the cheat code or attempt the incredibly finicky gulp skip. Shady Oasis has a chest on the upper level you need to head bash to open, as well as a minigame you can't even play without the head bash. Fracture Hills has a mildly annoying minigame where you have to escort this alchemist through a field of angry earthshapers, and of course the alchemist takes the longest, most roundabout route physically possible. Upon finishing this minigame, Hunter will tease a second minigame but won't let you play it until you unlock the head bash. The only problem there is that the level resets if you leave, meaning you'll have to escort the alchemist again before you can play the second minigame. A fun quirk that's still intact in the remake, by the way. If the second round was going to require an unlockable move, then why waste the player's time by allowing them to play the first round before they get the head bash? In total, that's 5 instances where, barring sequence breaks or other glitches, the designers expected you to abandon a level partially completed to unlock some ability before you could come back and achieve full completion. Most of these could have been avoided by just giving the player all their moves at the start or lowering the talisman requirements for the bosses. Yeah, it really doesn't take that long, but that just makes it even more pointless. If you're going to make me revisit a stage I've already played, then at least give me something substantially new to do when I get there. If all I'm gonna do on a second visit to Glimmer is light a few gem lamps and grab a handful of gems, there's no reason I shouldn't have been able to do that on a first visit. It really doesn't help that Spyro 2 always puts these backtracky areas at the very end of the stage, meaning that in the case of Sunny Beach, Fracture Hills, and Shady Oasis, you have to replay the entire level before you can grab what you missed. But hold on, remember the spirit particle system? Those reset too, meaning that in the case of Glimmer and Shady Oasis, you have to waste your time killing a bunch of enemies you've already killed just to reactivate the power-up gate so you can even play the minigames you had to backtrack for. Why not just play the levels you can fully complete on a first visit and save the backtracky stages for later? Well, I would, except you have to get all the talismans in every stage to fight the bosses so you can move on to the next hub world and unlock the moves you need to fully complete the stages. There's no way around it. That said, one of my biggest hopes for this remake was that Toys for Bob would fix the between-level backtracking using one of these methods. It saddens me to say that in the remake, you still have to unlock swimming, climbing, and the head bash from moneybags before you can use them, and you still have to collect every single talisman to reach the next hub world. I understand wanting to be loyal to the source material out of fear of alienating fans of the originals. I mean, I'm not surprised that the level design is entirely the same, warts and all, but a proper remake reevaluates old design and finds ways to improve or at least compromise. And truth be told, just keeping the cheat code would have probably been fine enough for me, but for some reason Toys for Bob removed it altogether. That's not to mention the fact that Spyro 3 Reignited was updated to have the treasure finder at the start, and if they can do that, I don't see why starting off with all your moves in Spyro 2 was too much to ask. Despite having access to really simple fixes that really wouldn't have removed anything worthwhile, Toys for Bob chose to leave the crappy unlock system and talisman requirements untouched, and I find that incredibly disappointing. Speaking of minigames, it's time we talked about those. Again, last time I criticized Spyro 1 for its lack of variety, an issue that only seems to compound with every repeat playthrough. In addition to the new mechanics, the Spyro 2 team also added some minigames to break up the pace. First off, flight stages returned from the first game, only they're called speedways this time around. These are essentially the same as before, though the looping and corkscrew maneuvers were removed and the stages themselves are a little more unique. I don't really have anything new to say about these. They're simple but fun, and you can't fault the formula when it works. The only real difference is that there are now hidden minigames you can play where Hunter will challenge you for secret orbs. Again, these are simple and focus on the central flight mechanics, except for the shooting gallery minigame on Canyon Speedway, but even that's so simple it doesn't really matter. The real meat comes in the minigames within standard levels. Many reviewers are apt to praise the side content in Spyro 2 for focusing on the core gameplay, which is true.
However, all that really means is that you're doing the same things you've been doing all game, so these minigames aren't actually adding any real variety.
My favorite side content in Spyro 2 comes in the form of straightforward mechanical challenges that test your skills with the controls. The time you ride Hunter's manta ray through rings is a good example. It's nothing amazing, but it's enough to engage me. In fact, my favorite minigame might actually be the trolley in Breeze Harbor, since it's decently challenging while feeling different enough from the core gameplay. Unfortunately, I find that the plurality of minigames in Spyro 2 are flawed for one reason or another. I've already discussed how minigames like Bombo the Flag Keeper or the goddamn Calyx add unnecessary back and forth and bog down the pace, but other minigames are just baffling. For example, in Hurricos, there's a minigame where you have to replace these lightning stones on these coils. Meanwhile, there are these thieves running around that will undo all your hard work, and your actual goal is to kill them all. Instead of replacing all the stones in the time limit or protecting stones from the thieves in a smaller playing field, they decided to make you run around putting stones back only to periodically kill some thieves and then put the stones back again. It's boring, makes no sense, and isn't fun at all. In Idle Springs, you have to complete these puzzles to help Foreman Bud get his tools back. The first 2 rounds are fun, but round 3 is a guessing game where you have to press these switches in a specific order. After replaying this game for 10 years, I finally figured out what the pattern was supposed to be on my PC run. Either way, the pattern is so obtuse that I usually just brute force this puzzle. Another baffling case is George the Snow Leopard in Crystal Glacier. You follow George around for 2 minutes while periodically flaming fish into his mouth and then leading him back to Shaman Jones here. I really don't understand what skill this minigame is supposed to test. Speaking of minigames with no point, in Scourge you have to charge trees to knock monkeys into a barrel. It lasts all of 15 seconds and I've never come anywhere close to losing it. That's another problem with the minigames. Some of them are so short that they leave no impact whatsoever, like the minigame where you help Hunter kill Earthshapers. Meanwhile, in Shady Oasis, the head bash minigame that requires you to replay the entire stage and kill a bunch of enemies only amounts to destroying some boulders, and you could probably finish it with your eyes closed. So yeah, that's 2 minigames you have to revisit a stage for, and they both last all of 10 seconds. So worth having to backtrack and reactivate the power-up gates, right? Then there are minigames that suffer from awkward camera angles. Case in point, hockey in Colossus. It's exactly what it sounds like. Suck up the puck and spit it in the opposing goal to score points. The first round just asks you to score 5 points, while the second round is a game of 1-on-1 to 5 points. The biggest problem with this minigame is the camera. Play any FIFA game or even Big Bumpin' and you'll notice they all have overhead camera angles, and for good reason. Now ideally the camera would look like this screenshot I took in Spyro World Viewer, kind of a 3/4 top-down view so you could see the whole playing field at once. Common sense action framing, right? Unfortunately, hockey in this game uses the standard platforming camera, making it difficult to know where your goalie is, where your opponent is, or even where the puck is. Couple that with the terrible ice physics or the fact that Spyro often clips through the puck and a skill point that requires you to play a perfect game, and you've got a recipe for frustration. People are quick to pick on the boxing minigame in Year of the Dragon, but at least that had a functional camera and better controls. And don't even bother accusing me of sucking or whatever. I've replayed Spyro 2 so many times that I can one-try all of the minigames at this point. But just because I can beat them easily doesn't mean they're well designed. I'm not criticizing them because they're too hard, I'm criticizing them because they're designed poorly. Next up is a 2-round minigame where you have to protect bone builders from lava lizards, which appear on the front cover for some reason. Yeah, I guess it's supposed to be Ripto, but it looks a lot more like a lava lizard to me. Once again, an overhead camera angle would have made it much more straightforward to locate the hatching lizards and kill them, which is important because you essentially have to kill them in order or else you fail. One final example is the Crystal Popcorn minigame, which reminds me of the Mr. Vile minigame from Banjo-Kazooie. You run around and try to collect 10 or 15 popcorn crystals before Hunter can. However, while Mr. Vile used an overhead camera angle so you could see where the munchlies were popping up, Spyro 2 once again saddles you with the standard camera angle, making it difficult to keep track of the action. I don't know, maybe there was some kind of technical reason behind it, but at the same time, the Turtle Soup minigame has an overhead camera angle, and so did the Ox Boss fight for that matter. I could go on, but I think you get the point. There are fun minigames in Spyro 2, but the handful that are good are very simple and very short, while everything else is mediocre to terrible for a number of reasons. So you might be wondering whether Spyro 2 Reignited improves on the minigames, but sadly they carry over verbatim to the remake, and some of them are actually worse. On the one hand, all the minigames I did enjoy in the original are still fun here, be it speedways or straightforward mechanical challenges. On the other hand, minigames that were mediocre or worse have not improved whatsoever. Lava Lizards, Hockey, and Crystal Popcorn still use the standard platforming camera, even though an overhead camera angle was definitely feasible in the Unreal Engine. In fact, using the remake's built-in developer console, I've confirmed that not only are these camera angles possible, but they don't seem to adversely affect performance either. Crystal Popcorn is a little cramped for it, but they could have broadened the ceiling and removed some of the set dressing. Point is, there was no excuse not to fix these camera angles. Strangely, the camera in the Turtle Soup minigame has actually reverted to the standard platforming camera, while in the Ox Boss it's left intact. The new right stick camera control picks up some of the slack, but still, what an odd change. Other minigames like George the Snow Leopard, the Barrel of Monkeys, or the Lightning Stone Thieves are still as bafflingly pointless as ever, and in the remake, the stupid monkeys even respawn after you finish the minigame. Speaking of changes for the worse, the Hippo Boulder minigame is noticeably slower than before, which means it's even less challenging, and the Earthshapers seem to have a longer reach in the Alchemist minigame, which makes it even more annoying than ever. It's especially frustrating since the Alchemist's potion doesn't even break in this version, so there's no reason I should have to restart. Oh yeah, and hurting Calyx is still a giant waste of time. Big surprise, right? Oh, and a few of you asked in the last review why I didn't mention the slipperier controls in the flight stages. Well, the reason is that personally, I don't find the flight controls noticeably different compared to the original games. But let's put a pin on that for when I talk about Spyro 3. On top of that, Spyro 2 Reignited on Xbox One shares the PS4 version's issue of needing 11 seconds to reignite whenever Spyro dies, which is thankfully cut in half on PC. Unlike Spyro 1 Reignited, however, the PC version can actually load stages within 10 seconds or less, and this is one case where I'm actually glad the cutscenes are pre-rendered. Seeing as Spyro 3 Reignited has similar load times on PC, you've gotta wonder why the Spyro 1 Reignited flight load screens were so bad by comparison. In case you're curious about the Xbox One X load times, I found it took about 20 seconds for the intro scenes to load compared to 5 seconds on the PC, so yeah, huge improvement on PC over console there. One thing I forgot to mention last time is that certain cutscenes in Spyro 1 you could skip in the original have become unskippable in the remake, from opening locked chests to collecting eggs. As impatient as I am, I actually didn't mind this too much since these cutscenes last all of 3 seconds. Unfortunately, the same thing does go for some things in Spyro 2 Reignited, chiefly collecting orbs or the Satyr cutscenes making you wait 2 seconds before you can skip them. On that note, the guidebook warp from Spyro 1 Reignited carries over as well, meaning you can warp to stages whenever, which makes the backtracking issue slightly better. Otherwise, the gameplay in Spyro 2 Reignited is largely the same. Last time I praised Spyro 1 for being fun and rewarding to 100%. Obviously, Spyro 2 has a lot of backtracking problems and mediocre minigames, but for the most part it's still straightforward to fully complete. In the first game, your reward for 100% was Nasty's Loot, a fun little stage where you could fly higher as you progressed, all the while collecting tons of treasure. In Spyro 2, you only need about half the gems and 55 orbs, and your reward is Dragon Shores. This is probably my least favorite final stage in the trilogy. All it really amounts to is a smattering of mediocre, tensionless minigames that you play to unlock the theater mode, and given what I think of the story, that's not a particularly enticing reward. I guess the shootout minigame is alright, but it's too easy and the second 2 rounds aren't any harder. Speaking of which, the trolley minigame returns as a 3-round roller coaster minigame where you pop balloons. The first 2 rounds are too easy, while the third just combines the first 2 in one run and adds balloons that you have to shoot, which is just incredibly redundant. Too much of this minigame is spent watching Spyro roll through unskippable scripted loops with no gameplay, and heaven help you if you miss a red balloon on your first attempt or you're watching it again. The rest of the minigames might as well not even exist, be it the Tunnel of Love where you literally do nothing at all, or the dunk booth that you could finish in 5 seconds. I understand that Dragon Shores is supposed to be a relaxing vacation of sorts after the main game, and I don't even mind the fact that it's essentially a minigame rush. As a secret final stage though, it lacks the challenge and mechanical gratification of Nasty's Loot. Much more interesting than Dragon Shores itself is this gate that will open if you reach full completion. Pass through the portal and you'll unlock Permanent Super Flame, which is far more useful than I initially thought. That's because Spyro 2 introduces skill points, long before trophies and achievements debuted in the 7th generation. These are mini challenges you play to unlock pages for the game's epilogue, which shows you what happened to all the characters between Spyro 2 and Spyro 3. For one thing, it confirms that Ripto somehow survived being incinerated in lava and ended up in the Dragon Realms somehow. So yeah, Ripto showing up in Enter the Dragonfly actually wasn't a retcon. He was canonically still alive as of this game. However, that's not saying much since the epilogue also implies that Hunter got eaten by a metal shark despite appearing in subsequent games, so the canonicity is kind of up in the air. Strangely, this epilogue has been completely removed from the remake in favor of a concept art gallery. That's fine by me, I guess, but considering how many pains this remake took to stay loyal to even the poorest of design, removing the epilogue is a surprising omission. In any event, skill points range from destroying objects in a stage to running 3 supercharge laps around Fracture Hills to ramming coconut trees. I'd like to note that there are absolutely no signifiers in the original game to indicate where the skill points are or how to unlock them until you've already found them, which is pretty bad. It would be like if every trophy in a modern game was hidden, except the game didn't even tell you that there were trophies or how many there were. Of course, we have the internet now, but thankfully in the Reignited Trilogy, you can view your list of every possible skill point and where to find them from the get-go. Some of them are actually pretty challenging, such as the ones that require you to beat the speedways in roughly a minute and some change, though strangely I found Ocean Speedway to be by far the hardest of these challenges. Similarly, you also receive skill points for defeating the bosses without taking damage, which is a fun challenge for Crush, but a frustrating waste of time for Ripto and especially Gulp. It's not impossible, and I have done it before for both bosses, but if fully S-ranking Sonic Unleashed taught me anything, it's not to waste my time when I'm not having fun. That's where the Permanent Super Flame comes in, allowing you to obliterate bosses in seconds and making for easy skill points in subsequent playthroughs. It's also very helpful for getting a perfect game in Colossus Hockey. Strangely, Spyro 2 was also unique in the trilogy for offering a New Game Plus mode, which I didn't even know existed for the longest time because there's nothing in the original or the remake that tells you it exists. I'd never played New Game Plus before this review because usually one playthrough of Spyro 2 was enough to get my fill, but for review's sake I decided to check it out for the original game. Essentially, if you pass through the Permanent Super Flame gate, then quit the game and start a new file, you can replace Spyro 2 with Permanent Super Flame from the off. While that doesn't sound like much, Permanent Super Flame snaps this game like a twig. I've already mentioned the bosses in Hockey, but why headbash the Earth Shapers or light rockets to destroy metal chests when you can just Super Flame them? Why fly around lighting gem lamps when you can shoot them in first person? I'll admit, there is fun to be had with playing through the game again in God mode to see what you can break, and it does make the game faster and can cut down on backtracking when paired with certain speedrunning glitches. Speaking of glitches, by far the most popular and easiest is the double jump, which you can activate by holding cross and pressing square, from which you can transition into a glide and then hover. You can also flop to clip up walls by holding cross and tapping square. Not only are they fun to use, but double jumping and flopping provide shortcuts and new routing opportunities. You might think that since you can kill the earth shapers and destroy the hippo boulders with permanent super flame that you could skip backtracking to those stages in New Game Plus, but no. Hunter and the hippo still won't let you play those minigames unless you have the head bash, even though in Hunter's case, the minigame immediately ends if you've already killed the earth shapers. While the double jump, flop, and boss skips were removed in the remake, it's still possible to skip backtracking in Glimmer and Sunny Beach with some well-timed perfect hovers, and the permanent super flame in New Game Plus carry over to Spyro 2 Reignited as well. Strangely, in the remake, it's impossible to start a new save file in Spyro 2 Reignited without permanent super flame once you've unlocked it, unless you input a cheat code to turn it back off, which is a bit strange. So yeah, I appreciate the speedrunning glitches when they work, and it is fun to see what you can get away with, but it doesn't really solve the underlying design problems. That being that I wouldn't need these glitches if the game was just designed better to begin with. New Game Plus was also fun for what it was and was faster overall, but the fact that it took until this review for me to want to try it is kind of the problem. If I wanted to replay Spyro 2, I wouldn't want to do it in God mode, I'd want to play it normally. Well, ideally it would be with the All Abilities cheat code, but you know what I'm saying. By the time I unlock New Game Plus, I'm ready to move on to something else. I don't want to play the game again immediately after. So, with all that said, does Spyro 2 solve the fatiguing lack of variety and mechanical evolution from Spyro 1? In my opinion, no, not really. I'll concede that simply having minigames to break up the pace is a step forward from Spyro 1, but many of the minigames are either not that good or emphasize using core mechanics in the same ways you've been using them all game. Yes, the game technically does have new mechanics to use, which theoretically increase both affordances and mechanical complexity, with swimming and the hover being strong evolutions of the core gameplay. In practice, however, the unlockable climbing or the head bash are too simple to really deepen moment-to-moment gameplay over Spyro 1. The biggest problem with Spyro 2, however, is the pacing. You'll recall in Spyro 1 that the Dragon Kingdom was segmented into 6 hub worlds, each with 3 stages, a boss, and a flight minigame. While the game didn't have as much visual or thematic diversity as Spyro 2, every time I was starting to get bored with the core game loop, the game would move on to the next hub world and transition to new visuals and gameplay. Spyro 2, meanwhile, only has 3 hub worlds and doesn't divide the game's 29 stages evenly between them. Summer Forest has 8 stages, and Winter Tundra has 7, including Dragon Shores, while Autumn Plains contains 11 stages, over twice as many as a Spyro 1 hub. From a pacing standpoint, this game becomes a real slog in Autumn Plains, where you play stage after stage after stage with the same core gameplay and no bosses or cutscenes to break up the pace and give you a moment to relax.
That really wouldn't be a problem if stages themselves weren't so inundated with within-level backtracking for mystery jars or magic lamp thieves or Balmo the Flag Keeper, as well as between-level backtracking for boring minigames you can finish in 5 seconds.
For what it's worth, the Winter Tundra stages are probably the best in the game since they minimize within and between-level backtracking and have overall better minigames, but by that point, I'm burnt out with the core gameplay and just want Spyro 2 to end. For as mundane as Spyro 1 could become in its back half, the game was still only 4 hours long for full completion, whereas Spyro 2 was about 6.5 hours long, with most of the difference coming from poor stage pacing, backtracking, and boring minigames rather than new mechanics or actual gameplay variety. Because of all this, I'm tempted to say that not only is Spyro 2 just as fatiguing as Spyro 1, it might, in my opinion, be marginally worse in that regard. So personally, I think my criticisms of the gameplay are more than enough to justify my conclusion on Spyro 2, but we still have to talk about the story at least a little bit. Now, of course, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but I don't think it's very good. Now, I will agree that gameplay has a higher critical weight in a platformer like this compared to an RPG or a walking simulator or something. If the game is fun to play, then a bad plot can only bring down the experience so much. I mean, mean, I could name 1,000 gaming sins in Sonic Adventure 2 alone, but I still reviewed that game positively overall because the gameplay was there. At least for me. Regardless, Spyro 2 actively flaunts its story and production value, and you get a sense that improving the story was one of Insomniac's goals for a Spyro sequel. Even then, I'd argue that story is always important in game design, insofar as it provides the player with an objective to contextualize and motivate gameplay. This is especially important in a collectathon, which essentially amounts to collecting a laundry list of useless crap or playing random minigames because the game says so. Banjo-Kazooie effectively framed the collection as a means of getting even with Gruntilda, a compelling antagonist the player loves to hate. Note that Banjo-Kazooie didn't need the narrative chops of The Last of Us or Uncharted 4 to accomplish this feat, so don't confuse my expectations for something they're not. So that begs a fourth question I'd like to address in this review. How well does the story in Spyro 2 contextualize and motivate gameplay? As I've argued thoroughly at this point, I can point to a number of gameplay flaws in Spyro 2, and to me that's enough to justify my opinion of this game. So, if you try to tell me that I hate this game because of the story, then I caution you to remember all the gameplay criticisms I've shared over the past 50 minutes before you write your angry comment. Now, of course, if you don't care about the story at all, go ahead and skip to this timestamp for the conclusion. Let's start off with some positives. As much as I enjoyed the coming-of-age angle of Spyro 1, the Dragon Elders weren't really that memorable as characters. Spyro 2, meanwhile, consolidates the action down to a main cast. We have Hunter, the scaredy cat with the heart of gold who's always up for a friendly competition, the Professor, the absent-minded genius, and my personal favorite, Moneybags, the scammer who would sell out his own mother for a quick gem. There's also Zoe the Fairy, but she's a glorified tutorial at best, as well as Alora, who's a surprisingly popular character given that her personality amounts to yelling at people and telling them what to do. Spyro himself is pretty much the same as before, but his snarkier traits have been toned down with his recasting to Tom Kenny. As for the titular Ripto, well, he doesn't have much personality or character besides yelling at people and getting angry all the time. Much like Spyro 1, they did get some good voice talent for this, including Tom Kenny, Greg Berger, Melissa Disney, and even Justin Roiland.
Hi, Spyro! Welcome to Glimmer! You must heed my instructions!
For the most part, I think the performances are good, but the production value is noticeably worse than the previous game. While every dialogue in Spyro 1 featured fully animated and fully lip-synced NPCs, most of the cutscenes in Ripto's Rage feature stock NPC models standing in place and repeating stock movements. That's typical for a lot of games, but the cutscenes from the first game still look like they had more time and money put into them. The main story cutscenes do feature full animations and lip sync, but I still think they looked better in the first game. I'm not sure what it is, but there's something about Alora's diamond-shaped mouth and soulless eyes, or Ripto looking like a Muppet, that just looks off-putting and unnatural. The sound engineering is much worse as well. Character dialogue frequently clips the microphone, and words that end in an S sound have a tendency to cut off prematurely.
Bringing a dragon here could just make Ripto angrier.
Calm down, Hunter, and stop fidgeting. How can we trust you with 14 talisman?
I persuaded that fat bear Moneybags to sell me a few bombs.
Despite all of that, the weird animations and performances are legitimately entertaining in an ironic way. It reminds me a lot of Sonic Adventure 2 in that regard. As much as I love that game, I would stop well short of calling the story in that game legitimately good. But the dialogue is so cheesy and the performances are so campy that I can't help but love it anyway. If I can give the story in Spyro 2 credit for anything, it's the only game in the trilogy where Spyro has any sort of chemistry with the antagonist. Nasty Nork effectively motivated gameplay, but was still a plank of wood nonetheless. As great as the Sorceress is, Spyro 3 seriously missed out in giving Spyro and the Sorceress a one-on-one convo before the final boss battle. I mean, there's still only 2 moments where Spyro converses with Ripto directly, but that's still 2 more times than Nasty or the Sorceress ever got. So yeah, the plot isn't without ironic and unironic entertainment value, but it's not not quite enough to make me overlook the distractingly terrible script and mediocre production value. Ultimately, Spyro 2's narrative collapses under the strain of two major problems, the first of which being Ripto himself. While I can give him credit for having more personality than Nasty Nork, as an agent of the plot and a motivator for gameplay, he leaves a lot to be desired. As I've argued, the purpose of story in a platformer is to contextualize gameplay in service of some kind of goal the player is motivated to accomplish. Despite Nasty's lack of personality or character, Insomniac managed to harness the Gruntilda effect somewhat in the first game. That is, motivating gameplay as a means of getting even with a compelling antagonist the player loves to hate. You'll recall that Nasty Nork himself kicked off the plot by freezing all the dragons and stealing all their treasure. As the protagonist, your goal was to undo the mess Nasty created by unfreezing dragons and recovering the stolen treasure. By playing stages, you were directly accomplishing these goals by freeing dragons and defeating Nasty's minions, who were themselves the dragon's gems transformed into enemies. The final confrontation with Nasty was given some dramatic weight as well, with the Dragon Elders taking him seriously as a threat and Spyro seeing it as a means of proving himself as more than just some snotty brat. Spyro 2 essentially attempts the Gruntilda effect again, but botches it in every way it possibly could. Imagine if you were playing Banjo-Kazooie, but Gruntilda didn't actually do anything until the last hour, nor had any palpable presence throughout the game. Meanwhile, Gruntilda was still there and would show up every hour or so to tell you that Gruntilda is bad, but never actually tell you anything about why you should hate her. That's pretty much the plot of Ripto's Rage. Remember that Nasty immediately established himself as a credible threat in the first 5 minutes of gameplay and invaded the Dragon Kingdom with an army of Norks, giving the player a reason to hate him and want to play the game to stop him from succeeding. In Ripto's introduction, either the Glimmer scene or the Winter Tundra scene, take your pick, we don't really get a sense of what his capabilities are or why we should hate him. All he really does is shoot a fireball and make some vague threats. He's also played so comedically in both scenes that it's very difficult to take him seriously enough for the plot to have any tension. Despite Ripto having just been carried off by some rando fairy, Allura and friends decide that Ripto is some kind of unstoppable juggernaut, so much so that they immediately turn to outside help to defeat him.
No! You despicable little creature! I'll kill you!
This is bad news for Avalar.
Once Spyro does arrive in Avalar, Allura and company pay lip service to Ripto being a threat, but don't actually tell you anything about why you should hate him.
That was Ripto, and we have to get rid of him. He's causing all sorts of trouble around here, but I haven't got time to explain.
No, seriously, what did he do?
And Ripto has caused enough damage. All his meddling has cost me a fortune.
What meddling?
Ripto may be gone, but he caused a lot of damage during his short stay. We'll be cleaning up for weeks.
Show us! The audience needs to witness Ripto's capabilities and destructive habits firsthand so we know the consequences of letting him succeed. That's where the tension comes from. If you don't show or even describe all the horrible shit Ripto's supposedly been doing, then there's no stakes or tension and the audience doesn't care. So what does Ripto actually do in this game? Well, he blows up the portal back to the Dragon Realms, he locks himself up in 3 separate castles and throws up banners with his face on them. He tries to feed Zoe to Gulp. Apparently, he blew up this bridge. And an hour before the final boss, he steals this power crystal. Oh, and how could I forget about his big evil plan to take over Avalar and rename it Riptonia, which actually has kind of a nice ring to it, not gonna lie. Yeah, that's it. Some of my viewers might counter that Ripto actually does quite a bit, seeing as he's ostensibly responsible for all the mayhem happening in the stages. Tiki's coming to life and attacking their makers, cavemen getting trapped in ice blocks, the water draining in Aquaria Towers, etc. Essentially, collecting talismans is just a means of getting players into the stages so they can witness and undo all the horrible things Ripto has done, thus motivating the player to reach the end of the game so they can give Ripto his just desserts, e.g. the Gruntilda effect. I'll believe that's what the developers were going for, but here's the thing. In the context of the game itself, there is absolutely no connection whatsoever between Ripto and what's happening in stages. Don't believe me? Ripto is never mentioned outside of the hub worlds even a single time. So as far as we know, the Tiki's coming to life, the ice wizards freezing the cavemen, and the water workers draining Aquaria towers are all completely unrelated to Ripto's supposed reign of terror, and this only further devalues Ripto as a threat. Compared to all of Avalar's inhabitants going to war with each other in every stage, some guy throwing up banners and locking himself in a castle just comes off as some minor inconvenience rather than the driving conflict of the story it's supposed to be. Some might point out that the manual outright states that Ripto is responsible for these specific things at least, but here's the thing. I'm not playing the manual, I'm playing the game. And in the game, there's no concrete evidence to connect Ripto to what's happening in stages. Again, this isn't the NES era of offloading story into the manual anymore. This is a game with full voice acting, animated cutscenes, and pages of dialogue. If Ripto is responsible for these things, either show him doing them or just say so. Remember, Spyro 1 and Spyro 3 had no hang-ups with directly blaming the main villains for problems in stages.
Nasty Nork is turning our swamp into an electrified junk heap.
That naughty sorceress has stolen the professor's rocket plans, and I'm on a secret mission to find them.
And even when they didn't, those villains had an army of mooks to give them a clear presence in those stages. Literally, all they had to do was write Ripto's name into the stage dialogue, and the plot would be 10 times better.
Okay, Spyro, looks like we got ourselves a bit of a situation here. Ripto has outfitted the breeze builders with enough explosives to take out our cities. We need you to destroy their munitions depot before it's too late.
Hey, Spyro! Welcome to Glimmer! Unfortunately for us, a mob of Riptocs just showed up and started stealing all of our gems. Can you stop them?
That Ripto has caused enough damage. Ever since he destroyed the Avalar Stock Exchange, my portfolio has been in shambles. If it wasn't for Spyro, I'd be bankrupt.
Now, I will concede that compared to Spyro 1 and Spyro 3, the in-level B-plots are more varied. And while I maintain that every B-plot should have been connected to Ripto in some way, making them self-contained vignettes wasn't necessarily a bad idea either. And in some cases, Spyro 2 actually does it well. Good examples include Breeze Harbor, Aquaria Towers, Idle Springs, Crystal Glacier, and Metropolis. The inhabitants struggle with the conflict, and by playing the stage, Spyro gets rid of the aggressors or restores the environment. Good. Problem is, half the time Ripto's rage can't even execute its B-plots properly. In Hurricos, the gear grinders activate some big bad machine, so the Electrol sends you to deactivate it. After playing a lengthy platforming section, you find an Electrol already standing there, unwilling to turn off the machine himself because it's loud? Like, what did I just do all that climbing for? Robotica Farms similarly sends you to turn on a giant bug zapper, only for you to find an NPC standing right next to it. You don't even have to press a switch this time. You talk to the farmer and the damn thing just turns on. Skilos Badlands is being attacked by fire wizards, but the actual plot of this level is helping some caveman win a bet, and the fire wizard problem is never referenced. If the NPCs don't care about their problems, then why should I? Zephyr sends you off to blow up the Breeze Builder munitions storage, but when you get there, you'll find some landlubber already inside working on that very thing, which means I basically played the worst level in the game for no reason at all. Mystic Marsh's problem is that the level's magic fountain shut off, allowing the local fauna to grow to gargantuan size and attack. When you investigate the fountain, you'll discover it's because the guy in charge was napping on the job. In Scorch, the plot is that Secret Agent Handel gets captured, so his sister Greta sends you off to rescue him. You get to the end of the stage only to discover that Handel has already freed himself off screen. The plot of Colossus is that there's some Yeti rampaging about, so the monk sends you off to deal with it. The moment you reach the Yeti, however, it angrily stomps around and then a statue squishes him. Yup.
Not even a boss fight. See what I'm getting at here? The comedy is plied on so thick that you start to wonder if you're really accomplishing anything at all. Did Avalar really need my help to solve these problems? The second major problem with the plot of Ripto's Rage is that the script is littered with enough frustrating contrivances that it might as well be written on a piece of Swiss cheese. For the most part, I don't usually get too worked up about these kinds of things, but there is a point where minor plot holes and contrivances pile up so much that they collectively become a much bigger problem. It all starts when Hunter decides to enter some random coordinates into the professor's new super portal, which opens a gateway to somewhere. By sheer happenstance, a sorcerer named Ripto pops out along with his two henchmen. Ripto decides he wants to take over Avalar for reasons. Ripto and his minions then immediately turn around to head back through the portal and grab their luggage. Now, the common sense thing to do would be to wait for them to go through the portal and then shut it off, thereby trapping Ripto and his minions on the other side. Instead, for no reason at all, Alora decides to remove all the orbs from the super portal and scatter them around, thereby trapping our villains in Avalar and eliminating the only means of sending them back. Seriously, why the hell did she do that? Even if only Crush went through the portal first, that's still one less giant monster to deal with than before. Apparently, the fact that there are no dragons in Avalar is a big deal to Ripto, even though we're never told why. Ripto doesn't hate dragons because it informs his character, but rather because it was the only excuse the writers could think of to get Spyro involved in the plot. Based off this offhand comment about dragons, Alora decides to open another portal to summon a dragon to defeat Ripto. Anyway, Spyro somehow arrives in Avalar by means that are completely unexplained. Last I checked, Spyro went into a portal to Dragon Shores, not to Avalar. So how did he get here? Anyways, Ripto immediately arrives and destroys the portal because otherwise Spyro could have just gone home and then the plot couldn't happen. Ripto then gets whacked around by his own minions, leading to his scepter getting destroyed. Otherwise, Spyro and Ripto could have fought right away and then the plot couldn't happen. Later on in Autumn Plains, Spyro defeats Gulp, causing Ripto's throne to tip backwards and supposedly sending him plummeting to his death. Spoilers! Ripto doesn't actually die, a twist everyone saw coming. Still, Alora falls for it, and Spyro decides to take a nap for, no joke, 3 seconds before immediately waking up and following Alora.
I think I'll just hang out here for a while and soak up a few rays. Hey, where'd Alora go? I better follow her.
Meanwhile, the professor unveils a power crystal to help send Spyro home, even though he didn't need one at the start of the game, so why does he need one now? So Ripto can steal it and make a new scepter, of course. See, the writers had to get rid of Ripto's scepter early on, otherwise the final boss could have happened at the beginning, but now that his minions are gone, Ripto has no means of defending himself and is thus even less of a threat than he already was. So they contrived to fake out death for Ripto and a 3-second nap for Spyro so that the professor could contrive another MacGuffin that itself only exists so that Ripto could steal it to make a new scepter, but would also be the very same MacGuffin that Spyro needs to go home, thus contriving a reason for Spyro to fight Ripto. Like, do you see what I'm getting at? The entire plot of Spyro 2 is a conga line of increasingly irritating contrivances that only exist so that the game can happen. The story immediately falls apart when you think about it even a little bit. Naturally, many of you are probably wondering, does the Reignited Trilogy improve at all on the story over the original game? While the Reignited Trilogy took pains to make every dragon in Spyro 1 look, sound, and gesticulate differently, unfortunately that doesn't carry over to the second game. Spyro 2 Reignited still recycles stock character models and animations, which was tolerable on PS1, but gives me serious Ratchet & Clank PS4 vibes in a 2018 release.
Spyro, Ripto's still alive, and he's locked us out of the castle. Even worse, he's stolen our new power crystal for the super portal.
Alora, those facial expressions do not match. There is at least automated lip sync on the vocals, and they did get multiple voice actors to play each species. The actual cutscenes, meanwhile, look leaps and bounds better than the originals. The animations follow the 12 principles to a T and offer a ton of subtle character detail that really bring each scene to life. Rather than lip sync that's just good enough, the animators took the time to choreograph every mouth movement. And with Ripto's more elegant, sinister redesign, he actually comes off as more threatening through blocking alone. The cinematography is noticeably more dynamic than the original game, which makes the cutscenes more fun to watch. One thing I do find odd is that the cutscene music is noticeably more irreverent than the original, short of a really tense moment, and occasionally they throw in some stock sound effects to emphasize certain lines.
I was a champion bantamweight boxer at university, and I still know a few moves.
My only real problem with these new cutscenes is that, once again, they're rendered in low-quality MP4s, even though by all accounts they should be able to run in-engine. As far as voice actors go, Tom Kenny and Greg Berger are the only returning actors. Spyro himself retains his more wide-eyed, childish characterization from Spyro 1 Reignited, while the professor sounds noticeably older and more scatterbrained, which fits. As for Greg Berger as Ripto, he sounds a bit weird in this game. He's not outright campy like he was in Enter the Dragonfly, which is what I was really hoping for.
Blasted! Where are they? Where are my dragonflies?
But his delivery is noticeably gravelier than previous games, and some of the line reads are just bad.
I persuaded that fat bear moneybags to sell me a few bombs.
They even included the S sound at the end this time, and it still sounds worse. Allura is now voiced by Cassandra Lee Morris and is noticeably cheerier than the original, with even
I'm a fawn, you dork.
being delivered with giggly playfulness. Hunter was recast with Robbie Damon and is noticeably more neurotic than before. As much fun as Greg Berger is, as time went on, his Hunter voice started to sound more and more like a stoner.
Space cows are everywhere, and now a big UFO is coming to abduct Farmer Dill's cows.
Robbie Damon, I think, fits Hunter's revised characterization very well.
Yeah. I would have gone after him, but didn't he say something about not liking dragons?
Possibly my favorite recast is JB Blanc as Moneybags, who absolutely kills it. The NPC cast also reads as a who's who of voice actors, including Cam Clark, Max Middleman, and even that elf Roger Craig Smith.
Now there's only one satyr left to rescue.
Fracture Hill's looking a lot more like Sand Hill right about now.
As for the story itself, unfortunately Spyro 2 Reignited follows the Insane Trilogy approach of the same script with new actors, which means that all the problems with the original script carry over here. For what it's worth, Toys for Bob clearly understood what was wrong with the original story and tried everything short of rewriting the script to clean it up where they could. For example, the scene where Gulp eats Ripto's scepter has much better blocking. Ripto actually tries to attack right away, so Zoe grabs the scepter to try to disarm him, leading to a tug of war that ends with the scepter in Gulp's mouth. It's still a contrivance to move the plot along, but I have a much easier time buying this as an accident this time around. There are lots of little touches like this, such as the professor's glasses breaking, Hunter showing character development by actually trying to get the power crystal back only for Ripto to sidestep him like a boss, Moneybags tripping over his money bag, and even Spyro's nap was increased by 1 second. They tried, they really did, but for all the fantastic new animations, high quality voice acting, and improved presentation, all of these improvements ultimately amount to putting lipstick on the pig that is this game's script. I mean, I can't really blame Toys for Bob too much, since hardcore fans would have complained if they changed the story, while the minority like me would complain if they kept it the same. At the end of the day, I suppose this was the most improvement I could have realistically expected, but I'm still pretty disappointed. With all that said, remake or rebreak? How well does Spyro 2 Reignited recreate and improve upon the original experience? Well, that's difficult to quantify without first solidifying my thoughts in the original game. As I've sat down to edit this hour and 20-minute behemoth and watched my thoughts play back in glorious 4K, I find myself asking an important question. Have I been a little harsh on Spyro 2? In a manner of speaking, yes I have. While I stand by all the criticisms I made in this review, ranging from the smaller nitpicks with the plot to the more major criticisms of stage design and content pacing, at the end of the day, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage remains an overall solidly designed, fun collectathon game. I mean, if I truly hated this game, I don't think I would have replayed it as many times as I have. In many ways, Ripto's Rage does succeed at building on its predecessor. The graphics are more creative and diverse, the soundtrack
is more expansive and better composed, the controls are tighter and more responsive, and there was a clear effort made to expand the universe and the characters. The level design is overall decent, some of the minigames offer fun, if brief, mechanical challenges, and the overhauled boss design is a clear improvement over the lackluster offerings in the first game. Most importantly, the platforming, combat, and exploration are just as inherently satisfying as they were in Spyro 1, and that counts for a lot. That said, given the fact that Spyro 2 is almost universally considered the best game in the series by hardcore fans, I always found that there were a lot of problems that other reviewers weren't mentioning. While I tried my best to keep an even tone in this review, when you're critiquing a game this universally beloved, it's very easy to come off as more negative than you actually are. But as a smarter, more talented man once said, you have to be willing to criticize the things you love if you want them to improve. And that's what I hope to accomplish here today. Unfortunately, all of Spyro 2's improvements are effectively cancelled out by the setbacks, meaning that the sequel ultimately makes no real headway over its predecessor. The level design, while better than most collectathons, lacks the cleverly hidden secrets that made Spyro 1 so much fun to explore. Moreover, they tend to emphasize unnecessary backtracking within stages, like chasing Bombo over and over again, tracking down mystery jars, herding cowlicks, chasing thieves that don't appear until you talk to an NPC at the end of the stage, and the list just goes on. While some of the new movement options are fun, especially the swimming, moves like the ladder climb and the head bash add little and are far too simple to justify being unlockable. More importantly, locking these moves behind paywalls introduces unnecessary backtracking to old stages so you can grab a handful of gems and play a couple easy minigames in 2 minutes and then immediately leave. The fact that these return trips are so short only increases their pointlessness, and I wouldn't have to learn speedrunning glitches or input a cheat code if the designers either let you fight the bosses with fewer talismans or just started you off with all your moves. While the mechanics are solid, the enemies are way easier compared to the baddies in Spyro 1, and the spirit particle system at best fixes what wasn't broken, and at worst forces you to re-kill 90% of the enemies on return trips to Glimmer or Shady Oasis. While the minigames theoretically add more variety compared to Spyro 1, and while there are a handful of good ones, most of them are either way too easy, way too short, frustrating, baffling, pointless, require a return trip with an unlockable move, or handicap you with unhelpful camera angles. Also, even if they do use the core mechanics, all that means is that it's not actually adding variety because you're doing the same things you've been doing all game. This, coupled with the odd design choice to cram a plurality of stages into Autumn Plains, makes Spyro 2 even more fatiguing than the first game in my opinion. Oh, and also the story has no stakes or tension, has awkward sound mixing and animation, is riddled with irritating contrivances to inorganically force the plot along, emphasizes an ineffective villain who does nothing but is treated like a major threat, and tries so hard to subvert your expectations for comedy that it hampers the player's sense of accomplishment. Put simply, even by kiddie platforming standards, the plot fails to achieve the bare minimum of motivating and contextualizing gameplay. When it comes down to it, I can understand why either Spyro 1 or Spyro 3 would be someone's favorite game in the trilogy. If you like straightforward collectathon action that's easy to speedrun to full completion and cuts out all the fat, then Spyro 1 is the best. If you want something with a really compelling narrative and tons of meaningful variety while polishing the core gameplay to the nth degree, then Spyro 3 is the best. While I personally prefer Spyro 3 overall, I can still enjoy and appreciate Spyro 1 for targeting an intended experience for a specific audience and delivering on it, making it my second favorite overall. Spyro 2, at least to me, just feels like the awkward middle child that fails to deliver the high points of the other two games while having few standout qualities of its own. It's not particularly fun to speedrun to full completion because of all the annoying backtracking within and between levels and emphasis on glitches to bypass things that shouldn't have been in the game to begin with, as well as an unsatisfying secret final stage. However, Spyro 2 doesn't really succeed with polish, variety, or narrative either due to the meandering level routes, a mountain of mediocre minigames, and lackluster narrative design. While some might argue that this makes Spyro 2 a middle ground of sorts between the focused but highly repetitive first game and what many consider an overbroad third game that downplays the core, I'd argue it just makes Spyro 2 a lesser version of its older and younger siblings. Because of that, I consider Spyro 2 easily my least favorite game in the original Spyro trilogy. If this is your favorite Spyro game, then more power to you, and I urge you to recognize that I don't hate this game and would still choose to replay it over Super Mario 64, Banjo-Tooie, DK64, and probably Rocket Robot on Wheels, because that core game loop is just that powerful and intoxicating. And you know what? It's not like I don't also love my own share of fun but messy games. I've replayed Super Mario Sunshine and Halo Combat Evolved a shocking number of times and consider them among my favorite games of all time. But these are still two of the messiest and most clearly rushed games ever made, and if you asked me to, I could break down in detail everything that's wrong with them. For me personally, the messiness just makes them more interesting, and I could certainly understand how Spyro 2 could scratch a similar itch for someone else. At the end of the day, however, I find Spyro 2 doesn't successfully target any engagement types that either the first game or the third game don't address better, and I wanted to explain why it is that I don't really enjoy replaying this game as much as the other two. With all that said, what about Spyro 2 Reignited? Given that I consider the original Spyro 2 the weakest in the original trilogy, I was interested to see how Toys for Bob would address any of the design issues. With the right improvements, this remake could have easily overtaken Spyro 1 as my second favorite game in the trilogy. On one hand, the new graphics are fantastic and a huge improvement over the original and even Spyro 1 Reignited. The new animations and sound design are also fantastic and breathe new life into the aging cutscenes. Everything that was great about Spyro 1 Reignited carries over as well, including the improved controls, the improved camera, the guidebook warp, and a few subtle creative touches that go a long way. For what it's worth, Toys for Bob also did everything short of rewriting the script to improve the story with better cinematography and production values. Unfortunately, when it comes to addressing actual design flaws, almost nothing has improved. From the pointless snow leopard minigame, to the bad camera and crystal popcorn, to the lack of challenge in the hippo boulders. Some minigames, like the Alchemist Escort or the Flag Keeper Chase, are somehow worse than the original. You still have to collect every talisman to fight Crush and Gulp, and you still need to unlock moves learned after you play certain stages to fully complete them, so the backtracking issue is still on, even though it could have easily been fixed. Meanwhile, stages proper still send you back and forth, herding cowlicks or chasing mystery jars, and are just as tedious as they were in the original game. A plurality of stages are still crammed into Autumn Plains, even though some of the backtracking could have been avoided by swapping stages around between hubs or moving certain stages to Winter Tundra. For what it's worth, if you already enjoyed the original the way it was, you probably won't find this version any worse. I've been ruminating on the appropriate score to give this game for months, and while it comes dangerously close to earning a remake score, I've decided to rate Spyro 2 Reignited a remaster. Essentially the gray area between reprise and remake, I reserve this score for a relatively competent, playable recreation that boasts some improvements but falls well short of expectations. Ideally, a remake should strive not only to improve the graphics or add new content, but to improve the existing gameplay as well. In the case of Spyro 1, that game was about as good as it realistically could have been, minus the bosses and lack of variety, so improved graphics, improved controls, and some features from Spyro 2 and 3 was all Spyro 1 Reignited really needed to make the remake tier. Spyro 2, meanwhile, has a host of gameplay flaws that really should have been fixed, but Toys for Bob didn't address any of them. And don't try to convince me that it's okay because they called it a remaster and not a remake. Like, you're telling me they could take the time to remodel everything from scratch, but changing the camera angle in hockey or crystal popcorn, or reducing the number of talismans needed to fight bosses to avoid backtracking was too much to ask? The fact fact that they took out the all abilities cheat code while keeping the terrible backtracking the way it was the nail that sealed the coffin for me. And because of that, I think I'm gonna be replaying the original from now on. Again, the new graphics are beautiful, and the guidebook warp is nice, but Toys for Bob could have done so much more and ultimately didn't. That said, this has been my mega review of Spyro 2, and next time we're gonna be looking at one of my favorite games of all time, Spyro 3 Year of the Dragon and Spyro 3 Reignited. If you liked today's review, make sure to give it a like and consider subscribing for more. You can also find me on the Unversecast, where I meet up with Haydox, Ryrule, and King K to talk about video games and read bad fan fiction. So Doom Eternal was like the one game I was like really looking forward to last year. This was before I played Astral Chain and Luigi's Mansion 3. Because before that point, Kingdom Hearts 3 was my GOTY, and thank God I played something better.
Jeez, shut up!
Good man, good man.
Ryan out here clapping in the back.
At that.
Well, I mean, of course you are, because you're the Kingdom Hearts apologist of our group. But we're going to be talking about Doom Eternal.
I stand with King K.
It makes it sound bad.
I stand united.
Well, I mean, I've seen your tweets, is all I'm gonna say.
Jeez, Michael.
Holy shit. Get him! Get him, Exo! Get him! Get him!
You're so
It's
brutal.
okay, I have good taste.
You can find video versions of the podcast on YouTube and an audio version on SoundCloud and iTunes. I also have a Let's Play channel, EPG Plays, where I offer informative playthroughs on games I like and some I don't. It's also the new home of Zebro's Play, sillier playthroughs I do with my brother.
Can we all appreciate how anatomically correct the fact that the moon is right behind the bell end?
What the fuck was that joke?
Go on, keep playing.
Oh my god!
Keep playing. You'll never look at this scene the same.
Be sure to go check those out. Until next time, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you enjoyed the review.